I gave my best years to that company, and they handed them to a man who didn't even know my name. My name is Danielle. I'm 42 years old, and for most of my adult life, I believed that loyalty and hard work were enough to earn respect, maybe even protection. I believed that if I just kept showing up, kept proving myself, I would always have a place, somewhere to belong. I started at the company when I was 25. Back then, I was just another hopeful voice answering phones at the front desk, juggling calls and calendars, smiling too much and sleeping too little. But I worked harder than anyone else. I took every late shift, learned every department, memorized names, stayed late, came early. And slowly, people began to notice. I moved up, first to HR assistant, then to coordinator, then manager. Eventually, I became head of human resources. I knew every person in that building, what they did, what they cared about, even which snacks they liked during long trainings. I was the one people came to when their marriages were falling apart, when they needed time off for a dying parent, when they felt they'd been overlooked for promotion. I saw people, and they trusted me. I wasn't just managing a team. I was holding the company together, emotionally speaking. I believed in what we were building, a place where people could grow, where they felt safe and seen. I helped establish policies that protected working mothers. I introduced mentorship programs for young women. I fought for equal pay across roles. It wasn't just a job, it was purpose. And for years, I truly believed I was making a difference. The founders, the original ones, respected me. They said I was the soul of the company, but then they sold it, quietly, almost overnight. The new owners came with big promises, growth, innovation, expansion, but they also brought new leadership, new men in expensive suits who never looked me in the eye, who never bothered to ask what we'd already built. At the time, I told myself it would be fine, that my work spoke for itself, that no one could replace the heart of a company. I didn't know it yet, but the man they brought in, the man who would eventually take everything from me, was already sitting in meetings I hadn't been invited to. And in those meetings, he was planning a future where there was no room for women like me. At first, it was little things. My name disappeared from group calendars for meetings I used to run. Emails about restructuring were forwarded to me instead of sent directly. I started noticing unfamiliar names CC'd on communications about my department, names I didn't recognize, mostly men brought in by the new leadership team. Still, I told myself not to overreact. "They're just settling in," I said to a friend over lunch one day. "It's normal when new executives come in, it'll stabilize soon." I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. The man they appointed as Chief Operations Officer, Brian Mason, was the kind of man who filled a room without saying much. He was slick, calculated, always dressed in shades of gray and blue. When he spoke, people listened, even if they didn't like what they heard. But he rarely spoke to me directly. When we did cross paths, he smiled like I was a relic. "You've done good work here," he told me once, his voice smooth and distant, like someone reciting a condolence. "But the company's evolving." That word, evolving, kept showing up in memos. Evolving meant faster. Evolving meant younger. Evolving meant fewer questions, fewer voices from people like me. Still, I kept going. I focused on mentoring new hires, especially young women. I kept holding space for those who felt unseen. I told myself that my role was shifting, not shrinking. But deep down, I started to feel the walls move. One day, I walked into a department heads meeting and realized my seat had been taken, literally. The placard that used to say Danielle HR Director was replaced with Ethan People Operations. Ethan was 29. He had no formal HR experience but had once worked on culture development at a tech startup that lasted 9 months. And yet, there he was, sitting where I used to sit. He smiled at me like I was someone's aunt dropping in uninvited. I stood there for a second too long before someone awkwardly brought over an extra chair and placed it at the very end of the table. It was the first time in years I felt invisible. But I didn't say anything. I didn't make a scene. I told myself, it's not worth it. Things will adjust. Maybe I'm just imagining things. Now I wonder, how many of us have told ourselves that if we just hold on, things will go back to the way they were? Have you ever convinced yourself that staying quiet was the stronger move? That patience was safer than speaking up? If you have, then maybe you already know where this story is going. I stayed late at the office more nights than I care to admit, determined to prove that I still belonged. I poured myself into performance reports, company culture presentations, and internal development plans no one asked for. I convinced myself that if I just worked harder, they'd remember who I was. But the truth is, they already had a new story, and I wasn't in it. One Thursday afternoon, I got called into a strategy sync with Brian Mason and a few others. The invite came without a subject line, just a room number. When I walked in, they were already seated. Brian, Ethan, and a woman from finance I barely knew. No greetings, no eye contact. Brian slid a thin packet across the table toward me. "We've been evaluating some role realignments," he said in that polished, too even tone. "You've been with us a long time, Danielle. This next phase requires different energy." Different energy. I stared at the paper. It wasn't a termination. Not yet. It was a transition proposal. They wanted to move me into a special consultant role. No team, no budget, no decision-making authority. A polite demotion wrapped in hollow praise. I asked if this was temporary. Brian smiled. "It's an evolution." I left that room feeling like my chest was full of broken glass. The worst part wasn't even the demotion, it was the betrayal. This company had been my second home. I'd missed birthdays, holidays, even my father's funeral to be there when they needed me, and now I was just a cost to cut, a piece they were reshaping until I no longer fit the puzzle. That night, I sat in my car in the company parking lot until it was dark outside. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just sat there trying to make sense of how easily I was being erased. Do you know what it's like to give everything you have to a place, only to be told that your best years no longer matter? Maybe you do. Maybe you've poured yourself into something or someone who decided, without warning, that your time was up. I went home and looked at myself in the mirror, trying to recognize the woman staring back. There were lines I didn't remember. Tired eyes, a tired heart, but somewhere beneath all of it, I felt a spark, a question I hadn't dared ask before. What if they're not right about me? What if I still matter, even if they've decided I don't? That night I didn't sleep. I planned. I didn't take the consultant role. I didn't cry, yell, or argue. I just walked out of Brian's office with a quiet resolve burning in my chest like a slow, steady fire. Something in me had snapped, but not in the way they expected. I wasn't going to break. I was going to fight. The next day, I showed up at the office at 8 a.m. sharp. I wore my most structured navy blue suit, the one that had always made me feel like I owned any room I walked into. I even added the pearl earrings my mother had gifted me after my first big promotion. I needed to remind myself who I was before they tried to reduce me to a shadow. Brian looked up from his laptop, clearly shocked to see me. His eyes narrowed, lips tightening. "Danielle, I thought we agreed." "I didn't agree to anything," I said calmly, stepping into the room. "There's nothing in writing, no formal transition plan. I'm still employed here, and until that changes, I'll be doing the job I've been doing for the last 18 years. He didn't respond, just stared. I smiled and walked away before he could speak. That week, I made sure they couldn't erase me. I sat in on meetings I hadn't been invited to. I asked direct questions in front of other executives. I reconnected with team members who'd once reported to me and offered to support them however I could. Some were hesitant, some were warm, but all of them were watching. I began tracking every email, every change in my calendar, every reassigned task. I printed copies of performance reviews, project sign-offs, and old leadership evaluation scores. I wasn't going to let them twist the narrative. Because this wasn't just about a job anymore. This was about identity, dignity, respect. Have you ever felt yourself being slowly erased? Not with violence, not with chaos, but through 1,000 small humiliations, orchestrated with a smile. That's what they were doing to me. I wasn't being fired. I was being softened, hollowed out. They were starving me of relevance so that when I finally left, no one would notice. No one would ask questions. I'd just disappear. But I've never been one to vanish quietly. When HR sent me an email suggesting a coaching session to discuss my tone in meetings, I responded by forwarding 6 years' worth of leadership feedback, all glowing, all signed by senior executives, some of whom were still sitting upstairs pretending they didn't know what was happening. When I received a memo about realignment of duties, I replied with a list of deliverables only I knew how to manage, tasks I'd developed from the ground up. I wasn't bluffing, I was documenting. And when they started avoiding me entirely, hallways falling silent when I walked past, emails left unanswered, I made an appointment with an employment attorney. Not to sue? Not yet. Just to prepare. I sat in that lawyer's office with a stack of evidence, a timeline of events, and a deep conviction that I wasn't just another expendable employee. I had built departments, led crisis response teams, trained half of the managers now being used to push me out. They wanted me gone because I reminded them of what they owed me, what I was worth. And worst of all, I still believed in myself. By Friday, I walked into Brian's office again. This time I knocked. He looked up, annoyed. Yes? I handed him a folder. In case you've forgotten everything I've done for this place. He flipped it open. Page after page of metrics, performance reports, testimonials. This isn't necessary, Danielle. No, I said, but it's real, and I want it in the file. As I turned to leave, he said, You know this won't end well. I paused. Not for you, maybe. Monday morning came with an email, subject, transition timeline, from Brian. I stared at it for a few seconds before opening it, even though I already knew what it would say. It was a sanitized execution notice, disguised with phrases like collaborative closure, knowledge transfer, and mutual agreement. I was being pushed out, formally this time. They gave me 6 weeks to transition my responsibilities and train the man who'd been quietly sitting in on my meetings. The same man I had once mentored when he was fresh out of graduate school. Brian had handed him my job, and now I was expected to hand him my legacy. Something cracked inside me that morning. I printed the email and pinned it to the wall above my desk, not to torment myself, but to remember, to stay angry, to stay awake. Those 6 weeks were a masterclass in humiliation. I was ignored in meetings where I had once set the agenda. My ideas were not aligned with the new direction. Emails I sent were never replied to. My former team began ceasing the man replacing me on everything. It was like watching your own funeral while still breathing. Even worse, the whispers. I heard them in the break room, in the elevator. I saw the way people avoided eye contact with me in the hallway. They were afraid, not of me, but of being associated with me, of getting dragged into my downfall. I started wondering, had I been blind all these years? Had they ever respected me, or had I just been useful? At night, I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying old wins like they were war memories. The project I'd salvaged when the company was on the brink. The crisis I handled when everyone else froze. The day I'd stayed up for 36 hours straight building a pitch that secured a $10 million contract. And for what? So a man with less experience, less integrity, and a louder voice could replace me like I was some aging software being phased out? I wanted to scream. I wanted to disappear. But mostly, I wanted someone to say, "This is wrong. She deserves better." But no one did. Do you know what it feels like to give your whole self to something, only to be treated like an inconvenience? Have you ever built something with your own hands, only to watch someone else put their name on it? Because that's what they were doing. They weren't just taking my job, they were erasing my name from the foundation I had poured my life into. So I started writing. Every night, I documented everything. Who said what? When it was said? What was removed from my calendar? Which decisions were made without me? Every microaggression, every passive-aggressive comment, every email that undermined me. I created a private folder called The Truth. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about reclaiming my voice, because they could take my title, they could take my desk, but they couldn't take what I knew. They couldn't take my story. Not unless I let them. I began counting the days. Each morning I'd cross off one more on the calendar taped to my cubicle wall, like a prisoner marking time until release. 28 days left, 27, 26. I was polite, professional, predictable. That's what they wanted. I showed up on time. I smiled at the people who ghosted me. I trained my replacement like a good little soldier. But inside, I was quietly falling apart. I remember standing in the restroom one afternoon, staring at my reflection. My blazer looked too big, my eyes were sunken, my lips dry. I looked like a woman in slow collapse. But I didn't cry. I hadn't cried since the meeting where Brian broke the news. I wouldn't give them that. Instead, I went home and cried into my pillow, where no one could see. And then I'd get up the next day and do it all over again. It was a quiet war, and I was losing. One Thursday, I overheard Brian in the break room. He was joking with another executive. They were laughing about fresh energy and how some people just don't know when to step aside. My stomach twisted. These weren't just corporate decisions, they were personal assassinations. I wanted to scream, "You built this company on my back." But I said nothing. Again. That night, I sat on my couch in the dark, a half-finished glass of wine beside me, my laptop glowing in front of me. I opened the folder I'd named The Truth. It was growing. Emails, meeting notes, screenshots, statements made in front of others, witnesses who remained silent, patterns of exclusion, subtle shifts in responsibilities that had stripped me of authority long before I was told I was no longer aligned. I read through it all, and then I asked myself something I hadn't dared to ask before. Was I protecting my dignity by staying quiet, or just protecting them from consequences? I stared at the screen for a long time. They expected me to disappear, fade out, exit gracefully. But why did grace have to mean silence? Wasn't it more dignified to stand for what was right, not just for myself, but for every other woman watching this happen and thinking maybe this is just how the world works? Have you ever been so gaslit, so minimized that you start wondering whether your pain is real or if you're just being dramatic? I had. But that night, I stopped wondering. I opened a new document and wrote a letter, an honest, meticulous account of everything that had happened. Not an angry rant, a professional statement, factual, calm, unshakable. I wasn't sure yet where I would send it, HR, the board, a lawyer. But for the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: clarity. This wasn't about revenge, it was about making my voice matter again. And for the first time I started thinking, not about how they'd pushed me out, but about how I'd push forward. Let them have the office, the corner desk, the title. I was about to take back something far more powerful: myself. When my last day at the company came, it felt nothing like I imagined. There was no farewell lunch, no speech, just a few scattered goodbyes, the kind people give when they don't know what to say or don't really care to say anything at all. Brian walked past my desk without a word, and I walked out without looking back. But inside, I wasn't broken anymore. 2 weeks earlier, I had sent the document, the one I titled Pattern of Dismissal. I sent it to the board, HR, and even copied the company's legal department. It wasn't angry. It was calm, precise, and impossible to ignore. I never got a direct reply. But 2 days after I sent it, I heard that the leadership transition was put under review. That wasn't my goal. I wasn't trying to bring anyone down. I was just done letting people step on me while smiling in my face. After leaving, I took a week to rest. Just rest. I turned off my phone, slept in, made coffee slowly, and watched the sun rise from my kitchen window like it was something I'd never seen before. Then I got to work. I reopened a small consulting business I'd started years ago but never had time for. I reached out to a few old clients, not with desperation, but with confidence. To my surprise, they remembered me. One of them even said, "We've been waiting for you to go out on your own. You should have done it years ago." That comment stayed with me. Maybe I should have. Maybe I had stayed too long in a place that stopped valuing me the moment I stopped being easy to control. Now, every day I sit at my own desk in a sunlit room in my house. My dog naps at my feet. My calendar is full, but on my terms. My mind is alive again. I thought I'd lost everything when I lost that job, but really I just lost the illusion that I needed them. I used to think success meant being chosen, promoted, applauded. Now I know better. Success is knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone else discount it. I had been quiet for too long, shrinking myself to fit into spaces that weren't built for me. But now I don't shrink. I expand. And maybe the biggest shift of all? I don't need validation anymore. Not from Brian. Not from anyone. I create. I lead. I building. And I do it all as me. Have you ever walked away from something that once defined you and realized the person you're becoming is so much stronger than the one who stayed? Because that's what this feels like. They wrote me off. But I rewrote the ending. They thought they could erase me with a final paycheck and a cold goodbye. They thought I would disappear, that I would crumble like I was nothing without their approval. But what they didn't realize is, women like me don't break. We bend, we grieve, we stumble. But in the end, we rise. And not just quietly, not just politely, we rise with fire in our chest and a voice we refuse to silence. Looking back now, I realize how often I put myself last, how I swallowed my pride, my brilliance, my instincts, all to fit inside a mold someone else created for me. I used to think I had to play nice to succeed, that I had to smile and say thank you even when I was being stepped on. But that was their story, not mine. My story? It's about reclaiming power in the aftermath of betrayal, about building something from nothing, about learning that dignity doesn't come from titles or corner offices, but from how you carry yourself when no one's clapping for you. And I carried myself out of that building with my head high. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because I finally understood something so many women forget. We are the backbone of every place we touch, every room we lead in silence, every project we pour our souls into. We don't need to be given power. We've had it all along. Now, I look at my reflection and I see a woman who's lived through humiliation, dismissal, and erasure, and still chose to stand up again. Not bitter, not angry, but certain of my worth, certain of my strength, certain that no man, no company, no system can take away what I've built inside me. If you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or discarded, I see you. I was you. And I'm here to tell you, you're not alone. There's a path forward. It may be rough and uncertain at first, but it's yours. And walking it with courage changes everything. Women like us weren't made to be quiet. We were made to survive, to rebuild, to rise again. So if my story felt like your story, if you've ever had to pick yourself up off the floor and start over, I hope you'll stay a while. Subscribe to this channel to hear more stories of women like me, women who've walked through fire and came out standing. And if you believe these stories deserve to be heard, please like this video so they can reach the women who need them most. We all fall, but what matters is how we rise, and I promise you, I will always rise again.